Hello and welcome to episode 159 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined with my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're probably going to talk a lot about OpTic, I would assume. OpTic Texas is kind of the talk of the CDL world at the moment, so I'm sure we'll talk about that. We have a lot to catching up to do because we didn't have an episode on Sunday. So we're going to be talking about last week's Major 2 qualifier matches and this coming weekend's Major 2 qualifying matches, the last weekend of the qualifiers before everybody travels down to Allen, Texas, and goes into Major 2, which could be a very, very interesting tournament, just for many, many reasons that we'll get into probably either on this episode or the next episode. But before we get into any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, got a lot to talk about, so we can, not beat around the bush. Do you want to just, I can like speed run the results and then we can just talk about any of the ones we actually want to talk about? Probably the
Yeah,
easiest way to
yeah,
do
that's
it when
fine.
we get a combo like that. All right. So yeah, super quick rundown of the matches, just because I mean they already happened a couple days ago at this point, and I'm already a little foggy and the specifics of all of them. But on Friday, March 7th, we had the LAT versus Vancouver Surge rematch of the Minor 2 finals. LAT won that 3-0. Was, some of the maps were pretty close. I mean, the least close was the 80-point hard point, but it's 6-5 in the Surge, 3-2 in the control. So another close series, but interesting for those who saw the minor that LAT actually won the hard point this time around. So that was the big difference here. They obviously won the searches except for one, and they dominated the controls against Vancouver in the minor grand finals best of 7. So the Thieves showing that, although Vancouver has been a pretty good team so far, they have their number early on. After that, we had Toronto versus Vegas. Toronto with a 3-1, where Vegas somehow wins the search 6-1. And I think that's just worth mentioning because that we, at least on this, I in particular on the podcast, had early on in the season mentioned Toronto as the early favorite for best S&D team at that time in like the Major 1 qualifiers. And, you lose a search to Vegas. I know search is probably Vegas's uh, best mode, quote unquote, of which isn't saying much, but for lack of a better term, that they're not a terrible search team, and they they beat Toronto here. So I don't think I think that knocks Toronto down a few pegs in the search team tier ranking, if that's actually a thing. But obviously, as Vegas does, they continue to struggle in the hard points, and Toronto wins the respawns to go 3-1 here. And then we had C9 versus Gentlemates, and C9 took that one 3-0. It wasn't necessarily close. Closest map was an almost 100-point win, so that's a 92-point win on Hacienda hard points. Somebody had a pop-off performance in all three maps. Sid 29 and 15 map 1, Kremp was 12 and 14 in map 2, and Attached went 25 and 10 in the map 3 3-0 control. So strong performance for Cloud9, definitely a difference than what we saw from them in the Major 1 qualifiers versus the Major 2 qualifiers so far, but big win for them there, most notably just because on the last episode we talked about Gentlemates potentially making a change. There wasn't an actual roster change. It was still the roster, Kismet, Lens, Priesta, and Lunars at this time, so we'll have to keep an eye out for that. Saturday, March 8th, we had Atlanta versus Minnesota. It was the first time we're seeing these two teams play after they both lost their first matches at the minor, when they were two teams that you know played pretty well at minor 1 conversely, but this time Atlanta takes them down 3-0. Pretty interesting series. The search wasn't necessarily close. Map 1 was a pretty highly contested hard point. Um, but I thought one of the interesting stats I saw, Paul X is 0-10 versus Atlanta now, which is just kind of, I mean, it makes sense. You think about the teams Paul X has been on in his CDL career, and they've been at a time when Atlanta phase has been pretty good. But just to hear that stat was kind of shocking to me. After that, Carolina versus Cloud9 was Carolina 3-1. I think this was a match that just based on the way Cloud9 had been playing, and Carolina kind of being a little bit of a roller coaster ride so far in the Major 2 cycle. This was one I had circled and was excited to watch, but literally this was the Gwynn show, especially in the hard points. He went 38 and 21, not once, but twice in both hard points. And C9 was able to take the control, but Carolina wins both hard points behind Gwynn, wins a search, is something that we have been wanting to see from Carolina with them playing well in search. And that gives them a big win over a Cloud9 team that seems to be playing at its best so far. So that's worth mentioning. And then after that, LAT versus Boston 3-0, not really surprising just based on the way both teams have been playing. And I think, that was LAT's last match of the qualifiers for that week. And they have a 15-1 map count now during the Major 2 qualifiers, and their only map loss is the Vegas Falcons. So that's funny, and it's also funny in the sense of like they could literally not have lost a map in these qualifiers if they just didn't lose the Falcons, which is just weird that that's the team to take them down there, but is what it is. And then after that, the big match everyone was looking forward to, really on the Saturday at least, OpTic versus Miami. Could OpTic change around his fortunes? And the answer to that was a resounding no. Miami wins 3-0. OpTic still winless at this point, not even winning a map outside of their win against Falcons in the minor. The map one was a super strange map. It was 186 to 175. It came down to time very, very quickly, it felt like. And then outside of that, there was a Vault S&D that was 6-2. I know I was watching the Scump Watch Party at the time, and even Methods was saying like a map like Vault S&D with how offensively favored it is, you should never see like a 6-1, 6-2 in that sense, because teams should really be trading offensive rounds, and then it's really just like one team to like break that is able to get like a 6-4, 6-5 win. So like in their eyes, it felt like he was saying like a 6-2 loss is almost like a 6-0 loss on any other map. So or a 6-2 loss on Vault is like basically a blowout is the feeling I was getting from what they were saying. So not a great performance from OpTic and the people hoping for a bounce back there, but surely they have another opportunity on Sunday to turn things around, right? We get that in a little bit. And on that Sunday, March 9th, we have Vegas versus Gentlemates, the highly anticipated 11 versus 12 seed match. And LAG get the win 3-0. Definitely Vegas had some chances in that map one. It was 250 to 215. And I really thought, I think it was like the second P4, Vegas had like a 20-30 point lead, and then they just kind of crumbled. Maybe I don't know. It was definitely a P4, that back one with the tub and the shower in it on Skyline. But nonetheless, they remain winless in hardpoint, 0-24 at this point. The search again, they beat them Vegas beat Toronto in search this weekend. And they play Gentlemates tough. Not like Gentlemates is the best S&D team, but 6-5 in the search there. And then Gentlemates take care of business and then control to give Falcons their 16th series loss in a row, which is a new record for the CDL according to Crone and CDL Intel. So we have that and the hardpoint streak to keep an eye on here going forward. Second match on Sunday was Miami versus Vancouver. Vancouver wins that one 3-1. Proudly, most people expected this result. Is a good bounce back for Vancouver after losing technically 2 series in a row because of the minor finals and their match against LA Thieves. But that's the first series that the only series they've played recently. So it is what it is in that sense. But they show what they're capable of once again with a 3-1 win over Miami. Then we have Toronto versus OpTic. Toronto absolutely dominates OpTic again, 3-0. Joe DeCeves drops 48 in the map one hard point, and then set a Black Ops 6 series record, I assume, for the CDL with a 2.05 KD for the series. So just absolutely dominant performance out of Joe DeCeves. And OpTic 0-6 map count on the week, 0-2 series count, still winless in the Major 2 qualifiers. Almost assuredly locked into a loser's bracket start at their home major. Yeah, so, and then final match of the past week was Atlanta versus Boston. We talked about this on the previous show. Atlanta had looked really strong against Boston. All of the previous times they showed up. This time around, Boston was definitely more competitive with Atlanta, which I think is interesting just based on the way Boston has been playing as a team in general. At this point, I would have expected them to be more competitive earlier in the season with Atlanta than at this point, just because they looked stronger earlier in the season. But in this match, Boston takes the first search 6-2. They had a crazy ending to the map for Hardpoint, and carried that momentum into, I think it was a 2-0 start on the game 5 search. Cammy, I know in particular, was like, he either had a streak or was close to a streak, and then the BattleNet servers crashed, and there was a super 30, 45 minute long delay. And that really, I mean, you don't want to make excuses, but like that feels like that definitely iced Boston's momentum. And like, especially if Cammy did have a streak, like, they red card isn't the best map for a streak, but it could have helped them out. And it felt like after that Atlanta just rebounded to close out the series for a 3-2 win. But nonetheless, it was definitely a closer match here than I expected, even though Atlanta were able to get the win in the end. So yeah, that was a about 10-minute rambling of all the matches. I tried to keep it as short as possible, but I did go a little longer. So I'm gonna drink some water now.
Yeah. So I think where we have to start, the only place that it would make sense to start is OpTic. So you mentioned that Methods said like a Vault S&D should be back and forth, and the fact that Miami 162 was really damning for OpTic. I wanted to point out that because you said that, and then Miami played Vault S&D in their next series against Vancouver. Vancouver beat them 6-1. So I don't know, like, if we're talking about like the transitive property where like Vancouver would have beaten OpTic like almost like 6 to -4 or something like that. I don't know how that works out entirely, but I think it does show that OpTic is so far behind pretty much every single team. Granted, we haven't seen them against LAG, so we're holding out hope, I guess, there to see if OpTic is worse than LAG, who has really not shown anything against other than Vegas, really. But they have essentially looked like the second worst team in the league. This is a team that, with this exact roster, won the World Championship 9 months ago. They looked like a championship contender just about a month and a half ago when they were going into Major 1. Obviously, Major 1 did not work out that way, and they make this roster change. And now everything almost seems like I can't say it's falling apart, but it seems like once they made that change, nothing was able to be built, essentially. Like, it didn't seem like they ever got momentum. Since they've brought Pred back into the lineup, they've won only one match. That match does not even count, really, because, of course, I think technically the match might count toward their win total, but it doesn't count toward the points. So they got nothing out of it, essentially. They beat Vegas, and they have not beaten anybody else. That is shocking, and I think what has been especially shocking for me, at least this week or this past week, is how much everybody has been talking about this. Because obviously we've talked about it quite a bit on the show, as we should, because this is a team that, for all intents and purposes, we expect to compete for championships along with Atlanta FaZe and LAT. Atlanta FaZe they won Major 1, and LAT was, they lost Major 1 by the skin of their teeth. They won the second minor. They have looked like the very, very best team since Major 1. So those teams have lived up to the hype. OpTic has done the exact opposite. I don't know if there's been a more disappointing team in recent memory. Like, I can't remember a team that had this high of expectations and just completely fallen flat and been so bad. Like, I pulled up that Pac-Man tweet that I said, I mentioned it before we went on the air, but I thought this was a good way of putting it. Pac-Man, obviously former player, former coach, I think even former OpTic Texas or OpTic OGLA GM, if I'm not mistaken. He was part of that. So he said, "I've never seen a squad of good players not win maps. Slumping sucks horribly, but not taking a map is purely mental. Good luck to those guys." And I think that's really the point. It's like, if they were losing these matches, it's one thing to lose 3-2, which they did right before the last major last season, where they had that horrible streak. But I'm pretty sure they were just losing 3-1, 3-2 over and over and over again. So there's something there that you could kind of take as like, all right, you're doing something right. Now they look horrible. They look like literally the worst team aside from Vegas. And I don't know if there's any optimism to be had from these matches. I know we had Michael in the chat a little bit ago said, OpTic going to smash everything come tourney, hopefully. I think that's the only, like, it's almost blind optimism or just like delusional optimism, I guess. That's the only way that you could look at OpTic in its current state and say they're going to go and do damage at Major 2. That's the only way you can look at it. And like you said, and I chimed in, they're locked into a loser bracket spot. So there is no buffer for, okay, they struggle in winners bracket round 1. Let's see if they get it together in losers round 1, or getting the lucky draw of lose in winners round 1, then you play Vegas in losers round 1, and then you are, all right, like at least we got something out of this. They don't have any chance to play Vegas. So they're really going to have to play a team that probably, like, I again, like maybe they are better than LAG, but I kind of doubt it. I don't know where to go from this. I don't know if you have thoughts on OpTic from this past week, because they only had one match last week, so you can kind of, convince yourself, okay, it's just one match. But this was 2 matches against, 2 teams that haven't looked incredible as of late, and they got smoked both times.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can really talk about, and I don't want it to seem like, there's obviously going to be those Greenwall supporters who are like, yeah, everybody's talking about OpTic and shit talking them, yada yada. It's like, well, there's not, OpTic's the most popular team. It's no other way to phrase that. And it's like, LeBron goes through the same thing. I think we talked about the Stephen A stuff last time we were live. Like, there's just, they're always going to be a topic of conversation. And when they aren't playing well, it's going to seem like people are piling on them, but that's just the territory they are in with the popularity they've accrued over the years. And in the sense of over the years, I kind of was talking to you about it right before we went live. Like, there have been OpTic teams previously that have not played well, and I know there's the Hex quote that went around where he's like, I'll just pull it up, and this is the most talented team we've ever had outside of the dynasty, but right now you're the worst team that OpTic has ever had. And the clip was really funny because, like, he says, like, you're the worst team, the worst OpTic team. He says it like 5 times, and Dash and Formal are cracking up because it's like he's not saying it once, he's not saying it twice, like he kept on saying it. And I just think that, like, mentality of it, he even says, like, or I think after that he says, you're the worst team that OpTic's ever had right now, but you have the potential to be the best. And True. I do think that's like an interesting way to look at it, because, it would be really hard to compare this team to the dynasty in terms of like tournament wins, just because of the eras and how many tournaments the dynasty played in versus this team. And like, even if this team wins champs this year again, they would have more world championships than the dynasty team, but they would only have like 3 or 4 championships, and the dynasty team had double digits, if my math in my head is correct. So it'd be an interesting topic of conversation, but I do think that's like got to be the mentality around it. Just based on everything we've been hearing, it really doesn't seem like they are of the mindset right now that they want to make a roster change. It feels like they really want to make it work with this team, just because they know the potential is there, they know the talent is there, and they just got to figure out a way to put it all together. And it's interesting to think about it in that perspective that, like, yeah, I mean, if they do put this together and end up winning a championship again, they could go from having one of the worst parts of the season ever in OpTic history to being one of the best teams in OpTic history ever. And on that note, one of the similarities, I know I mentioned some, was the conversation around quote unquote worst OpTic team ever. might be a little harsh because there have definitely been some moments over the years where OpTic haven't performed well. I mean, even like for that dynasty team, I know I mentioned it to you. They were like that one. It was in the IW season. I think it was CWL Atlanta. They were round 11 1v1 between Karma and Fastball on Panda Gaming away from a pretty subpar placing to start that IW season. But
They would have
they,
broken up.
Karma. Say that.
They would have broken up too. That's what they've
Yeah,
always
yeah.
said since
So
then.
that was like the feeling in the community at that time, and obviously like the champs in 2018 where they didn't even make it to part of the tournament where we were attending and fans were allowed there. So there have been other moments where things haven't gone OpTic's way, and they've always rebounded in the past. So I definitely think the potential's there, and I think the biggest similarity of what's going on right now that can really, or just a parallel really, that can be drawn is the one for LA Thieves in Vanguard 2022, the Major 2 qualifiers. That team went 0-5. Now the difference is that team, the LA Thieves, they come in last place and have no points, but they were 7-15 in map count. So 7-15 is different than not having a single win in these qualifiers. But at the end of the day, like that's the biggest similarity that I could draw a parallel to. And then obviously that Vanguard LA Thieves team goes on to win COD Champs and Major 4 that year after struggling in the Major 2 qualifiers. The other similarity there is Kenny is on both this OpTic team right now and the LA Thieves team that had that struggle during the Major 2 qualifiers during Vanguard. So you can do with that information what you want. That's just something that came to mind for me. But really, just overall with this OpTic team, I don't know what the actual answer is and how they're going to fix it, but it feels like to me, based on everything we've heard so far, is that it feels like they want to make it work with this squad. And I know I've said it on multiple episodes before. I feel like it would have to take like a major player, major domino to fall for OpTic to make a big time splash and make a move that had massive ramifications across multiple teams in the CDL. The only other thing that I wanted to mention on the OpTic front was that the breakdown that the Desk, Nameless, and Maven did of Listen In for, I believe it was in the Miami match. Let me pull that up real quick. Yeah, so it was on the red card hardpoint against Miami, and I don't think Nameless was like super critical. He definitely was critical, but I don't think it was anything like too harsh, and I don't necessarily totally agree with the main premise here in this listen is that like there's a point on one of the hills where Pred is like, Kenny calls out where the players on Miami could have spawned, and then a couple seconds later Pred like says where'd they spawn or something like that, and I think it could have been interpreted as like he didn't fully hear what Kenny said or wanted like re-clarification or something, and it felt like Nameless and the Desk were basically saying like Pred doesn't know the spawns, and that's what caused them to like the guy spawns where Kenny says, and then Kenny dies, and Miami breaks the hill, etc. And while I do think Pred had that break for his personal reasons, he hasn't played as much as some of these other pros who have been playing the game every single day since the game has been released. At the same time, there really shouldn't be an excuse for someone of Pred's caliber to not, know the spawns. And I don't know. It's tough. Like I don't
Snoopy
again.
Situation.
I don't think it's make or break that one scenario is why OpTic haven't won a single map. Like I don't think that's the conclusion you can draw, but it could be used as just like evidence to support that the team has stuff to work on, whether it's individual spawn knowledge or more like detailed nuanced stuff, and or even less nuanced stuff, just like basic communication and stuff like that. So I thought that was I thought it was interesting the desk went back and broke it down like that. Like, obviously, that's something we wouldn't have really caught on to if there wasn't a listening in that exact moment. But that definitely was, again, I don't think that's the sole reason why things have gone so poorly for OpTic, but it was a little like eye-opening to the sense of like they clearly have stuff they got to work on.
Yeah, and I'll give Pred the benefit of the doubt because, like you said, it could have been just I didn't hear you. Can you repeat that kind of situation? And it wasn't necessarily his in-game knowledge, but that is certainly a narrative that will be used against Pred and this OpTic team in general, and rightfully so in a sense, because like there's just no way that 4 talented players like this should be able to lose this many maps consecutively and not be able to show a lot of fight and a lot of promise. But that's the scenario that they're in. Earlier what you said about like, OpTic fans might feel like people are ragging on OpTic like unnecessarily. I would say that like this is due. Like, I mean, we've given them the benefit of the doubt for like a lot of weeks. Like, and I still believe that they have the capability to turn it all around and come into Major 2 and, win a few matches. And then it's like the monkey is kind of off their back at least a little bit. But we gave the same criticism to LAT and FaZe at different points of the season. Granted, it was different. Like their circumstances were different. With FaZe, it was really like 2 weeks, and that was like the bulk of the criticism. And it lingered for a month because they looked so bad before we had this break. And then so we used that break to talk about how bad FaZe looked for those 2 weeks. With LAT, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks as well, where they didn't look great at Minor 1. They lose, and I think they struggled for the next week or two in the qualifiers. And we kind of poked fun at them because of Nadeshot's comment around that time and just like the general sense that they were not as solid as they appeared to be heading into Major 1. But then like they both pulled out of it and they were able to have success, and they've both won events, if you want to call it if you want to call Minor 2 an event, but they've won tournaments, I guess, since then. So like we don't have the same criticism for them. And if OpTic Texas is able to pull out of this again and be able to compete at a high level against those teams, or just like the upper echelon of the CDL, then we won't criticize OpTic very much anymore. And it becomes more like granular stuff of like, why can't they get over the hump? That's the criticism I expected to talk about with OpTic Texas, not like why can't they win a map. I think when you can't win a map, if you're Vegas Falcons, if you're OpTic Texas, if you're LAG, etc., you're going to get criticized regardless. And I don't think anybody, I'm sure there are people that are being mean-spirited and using this to kind of hate on OpTic or whatever, but that's not what we're doing. I think like it's really legitimate criticism when you're 0-15 in the qualifiers and the only win you've gotten in like the last month is against the Vegas Falcons in the minor. Like that's pretty ridiculous. But yeah, I don't know where they go from here. I also wanted to bring up like, I agree with you that OpTic seems pretty set that they want this team, this particular roster. They want this team to stick and work out. That being said, I don't know of a team, I can't remember a team in really major COD history that has gone through the lows like this. Like, so let's say they go 0-7 in these qualifiers, and let's say they go 0-21 in the qualifiers. They go to Major 2, their home major, and they get 3-0'd. I have a hard time believing that even with how much OpTic, I guess the management and like the community maybe wants this team to stick because they are the defending champs, I have a hard time believing that they won't make a change at that point. Like that would be ridiculous. That would be like, if we're not counting the minor, that would be like what, 8 straight matches lost and 24 maps in a row lost. Like that's ridiculous. Like not even Vegas is doing that. Vegas has a better map win percentage in the qualifiers than OpTic Texas does. and Vegas is 3-18. Like that's sad. Like that's not good. Like even if you take away because Vegas has played one more match, like they would still have like they'd be 2-15 or whatever it was. Like OpTic can't like I just can't fathom like a scenario where any team, regardless of the situation, is like, yeah, we're cool with you going 0-7 in the qualifiers and getting first rounded while not winning a map. That just seems like I can't think of any team that would do that. If FaZe or LAT, like they would 100% make a roster change, even if it's like, I think we have something here. That being said, I don't know if OpTic will. Like maybe OpTic is the exception to the rule. Maybe OpTic is just so set on Pred and these guys being in the team and Kenny and like I think Kenny, like we said, is like the odd man out if they do make that change.
Yeah.
But there isn't a logical change that they can make that just is like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Like we'll just slot him in. But maybe that's what they do. And one last thing is like the idea that they are the worst OpTic team. I think that's undeniable, which is how they played in the last like month. Because no other OpTic team, from what I can remember, has played this poorly for like a month straight. Just not winning maps is pretty crazy. That being said, they do really have the chance to be the best OpTic team. And, some people will be like, well, the Dynasty team will be better. If OpTic wins champs this year, then who cares? Like the Dynasty team is second regardless. Because this would be the first team ever, not even just OpTic. This would be the first roster ever to go back-to-back at champs. And they would be the best team, like, maybe not in terms of consistency, but the highs, they would reach higher than anybody. This would be basically like if the Chiefs had won the Super Bowl this year, like winning 3 straight. No other team had ever done that. So, like, whatever you want to talk about, like, doing something no other team or no other roster has done, that's, like, you can't dispute that. So, they do have a chance to be the best team. I just don't know if they'll even get there. Like, that just seems crazy that they might continue and keep this roster with all of the problems that they're going through right now.
Yep. And I just think from the roster perspective, it really, my whole thought process has really been, like, what readily available player really changes things in a drastic way for OpTic. Like, the example I keep coming to in my mind, like you said, it feels like, just based on history and everything we know, like Shotzi and Dashy aren't going anywhere. Pred just came back, so I mean, obviously there's a chance they might move Pred, but Kenny seems like the most likely to be the scapegoat or just that person who bites the bullet if a move is made. What player from challengers can you bring in and it's like, oh, OpTic, night and day changes? And like right now, in my eyes at least, like you think of guys like Fellow, who's been playing well in challengers, and if Fellow joins this team, does that really like push the needle for the squad? And I think Fellow, you just have to say like he would bring a fresh perspective to the team, and he would probably, help them win some maps, which obviously is more than what they're doing right now. But that doesn't feel like a major move in my head. And even if a guy like Arcides, who has some familiarity with the squad, they make a move for Arcides over Kenny, like I don't know. It feels like to me there would have to be some drastic move from a player in the CDL, someone like Sib, which I don't even know if C9 would want to make the move, but that Sib really at this point, it feels like he is like just raw slaying. He doesn't, I could be misinterpreting, but just based on what I've seen out of him play style wise, he's just that guy. He's going out and just killing what's in front of him. He doesn't bring, or it feels like he won't bring a lot in like a communication standpoint or leadership standpoint. So that would be the trade-off there in the sense with Kenny, in my eyes at least. How much does that change thing for this OpTic squad? Sure, they would be getting more kills, but like if they're already struggling with communication and stuff like that, now how much does bringing in somebody who's super focused on slaying change things for this team? And that's just an example, because we don't even know if someone like Sib would be available. I know I said in a previous episode, like you would have to, OpTic gets a guy like Scrap, which I don't see being remotely happening, but like that's the type of move, something where it would, and then in a world where SIB goes to OpTic, Cloud9 has to make another move. That could cause some domino effects, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I think. If OpTic does eventually make a move, it would have to be a splash. It would have to be a big name acquisition trade. And I just don't know what the answer would be. And I don't know how much it would change what's going on with this team. I don't know. It feels like with Pred coming back after his hiatus earlier in the season, OpTic had an opportunity to build from the ground up. There was a clip, I think, of Karma talking back then of comparing the roster. It was we talked about it on one episode. I remember he was playing Marvel Rivals in the clip and talking about how they were gonna have to build from the ground up on what they knew just because of Pred coming back and not having played. And it feels like maybe that's part of this and that's why they've been struggling. But at this point, they haven't won a map. You might as well just go back to square one and try reinventing whatever you've been doing, because clearly what's been happening so far isn't working. And that's not to put any blame on Karma or anything like that, but I really don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's one part where it makes sense. Okay, we have to kind of build back up because, this is a new iteration of the roster and they've been separated and stuff. I get that. But it's it's the fact that they're not winning maps. That is my biggest thing. It's winning matches is hard. We've seen that in the past. We've seen really good teams go on slumps, but not winning maps is just kind of ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. And they're some of these are blowouts. They're not close. And that doesn't make sense with just talent. OpTic, I would say in many iterations of their rosters over the years, they've been able to get by on just pure talent, pure slaying power. We will overwhelm you, even if we don't have the best teamwork or we're working through it, we're progressing, or the chemistry might not be there instantly. We have so much slaying power, we have so much star power that we're able to just overwhelm our opponents. That hasn't happened this time around. And I don't know why, because this team has all the star power. They have all the slaying power. Everything that you would want is right here. And we've seen it in the recent past that they've been able to win championships with this exact team, and it's not working out. I would say that the roster moves that we were talking about, I think Toronto would be interesting, just looking at Kleenex, Insight, is there a way to get one of those? Because Toronto has, they let Scrap go. They seemed more, and Envoy, they seemed more willing to part ways with talented players if the price was right, which has not always been the case. We've seen that with most notably the Seattle Surge with Pred a few seasons ago, where they kept driving the price up and then they essentially priced themselves out of a buyout for Pred to OpTic. I will say on that note, what if it was, I don't know if the roles would necessarily work, but Neptune has obviously been a pretty incredible pickup for the Vancouver Surge. What if OpTic is we want Neptune too? We want this exact player to help our team try to, Vancouver was lost and just kind of floating out in the ocean basically, and OpTic is, I would say, in an even worse position now than Vancouver was. What if OpTic is hey, Surge, do you want to go round two? You want to try to reach a buyout for Neptune, which would certainly be less money than what Pred was going for a few seasons ago. I don't know if Vancouver would do that. Obviously, they're in a great position with how the last month have gone, and they seem like they're in the top 4 in the league right now. But it also depends on the same thing that we talked about with Pred back then was, do you really think you can win a championship? If so, then go for it. If not, then you probably should sell. And they didn't sell then. I would be interested to see if they would sell now. I tend to think not. But, it would be an interesting idea. And something that I don't know if it has any validity, but there have been rumors that Skies would be an option. Obviously, he does seem like he could be an option just by logistically, he is now on the bench for the Gentlemates, and he announced on his stream that his contract ends in a month and a half. His contract would be terminated at that point. So his buyout, he said, would be pretty low because it would just be buying out a month and a half of his contract, and it would seem pretty simple. Like if OpTic wanted to go that route, that's not a big splash like you're saying. Like that is certainly not something that would kind of like reinvigorate the OpTic fan base at all. It might help stabilize them, but I think they run into some of the same issues. I don't really know how roles would necessarily work either. I want to get your thoughts on that, whether skies, would be like something for OpTic, or it would just be kind of kicking the can down the road, so to speak.
No, I mean, it could be something in the sense of like, he would join that conversation of like a readily available player, quote unquote, just because of the contract situation and everything like that. I just think in general, like it's kind of wild to me. I know, don't get me wrong, I know Kenny has not played well and has statistically been a pretty poor player in this set of qualifiers. Nobody can debate that. I know Kenny even had a tweet at one point we mentioned where he acknowledges he's been playing poorly. But it's not like it's ancient history to the last time we saw Kenny like absolutely popping off. Like obviously World War II was 7 years ago at this point now. That's, he comes back to the scene. That's I don't want to say that's his peak because obviously then Vanguard, he wins the world championship. And I'd say that's his peak just because that was an interesting season because we talked a lot on the podcast that there was always the conversations around the role switching between Draza and Kenny at that point. Like it felt like at some points Kenny was using a sub and popping off, and then Draza would pull out the sub and Kenny went to an AR and things didn't work out. And I think towards the end they went back to Kenny on a sub, and that's when they really started to pick up and improve from LAT's perspective at that point. But not it feels like people now, like obviously I know again, as we've broken it down from a roster perspective, Kenny being the quote unquote scapegoat or whatever, it is not ancient history since the last time we've seen Kenny be a star caliber player. Like he's still really good. It's just obvious things aren't working out in the way they are right now. And we've talked about it last year after they won champs. Like Kenny has entered into the top 15, no matter where you want to put him, really, of Call of Duty players all time. So like someone like Skies has a world championship, but how much really does that replacing that talent of what we know Kenny is capable of, how much does that really change things? I don't think it really makes a huge difference. I think maybe just based on the way they played, Skies would bring a little bit more in Search and Destroy. But even like, the Gentlemates team this year wasn't good and hasn't been good. And I'm not going to say that's totally Skies' fault or anything, because even with these roster changes they've made recently with Lunars coming in for Priesta and then Priesta coming in for Skies, I haven't seen drastic improvement out of that squad. And I don't know. So I don't think Skies would be the answer, even though it could possibly make sense from like a contract and financial situation. The only thing that I was just thinking about when you were talking though is I don't know. I feel like, even 10 minutes ago when I just said like, Shotzi and Dashi aren't going anywhere. If they really do go, 0 and whatever here and they go winless in the qualifiers and in Major 2, like it might come down to not like, OpTic doesn't want to get rid of Shotzi or Dashi, but maybe Shotzi and Dashi want to leave OpTic. And that could be a major domino in that sense. And I don't remember how it all went down, but there was definitely the conversation and rumors in the community of like Shotzi potentially going to FaZe back before Scump retired. And then like Scump called them and said like, or Shotzi said like, if you come back, I'll come back or something like that. Then obviously there was the Dashi stuff, not too long ago where with Rambo and everything. So as as much as it seems like OpTic wouldn't move from Shotzi or Dashi, maybe those guys are just like, I gotta get out of here and do something different. I don't know. That would be crazy, and that would be a bombshell. But like, let's just say OpTic struggle here, and then Shotzi's like, yeah, I'm gonna leave, and I don't know what team would make a move. for him, and that would be a major domino in a sense. But like, I'm not going to rule that out completely if the struggles continue. It's just another interesting thought, I guess.
Yeah. The only problem is that there's only a few teams that seem like they're even eager to kind of spend the money that would would cost. And at the moment, like two of those teams, I think the four teams, maybe five if you can include Toronto. But obviously LAT wouldn't make that change at the moment. OpTic is one of those teams. Obviously, it wouldn't apply to them. And then there's FaZe, which I don't think they make that change at the moment. And then it's C9 and Toronto. And like, who knows? Like, I think C9 would be willing in terms of the money, because Jack seemed like, I'm willing to spend the money on Hydra. I'm willing to spend this money on like this championship level team. And if he can get Shotzi, I think that makes sense. Toronto, I think if they felt like they could win a championship, I think they might go all in, kind of like what LAT has done this season, where it's like, all right, like we know we can do it if we get this guy. It kind of depends on how that works out. I do think there's also the connection of Overactive and Splice, and obviously that was where Shotzi was before he got bought out by Envy, if I'm not mistaken. So that was a while ago, and there's probably not a lot of crossovers anymore. But it would seem, like at least Toronto has shown in the past that they do have like the capability to compete for championships. They've been to a few grand finals of champs. So, that's what I'm thinking about. But in season, it would just be really difficult. But yeah, that is something that we haven't really talked about, that they, maybe at least if one of them says, hey, I'm not feeling it anymore. Like, I feel like we got to make a change. That could just be a domino effect within the team, that, who knows where that leads.
And just sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I was saying, like with the dynasty, like the way that whole situation broke down, that felt like it was more like out of game stuff crossing in with the in-game struggles to a sense. But like that trade of Formal to Luminosity for Octane, like that's I don't remember exactly how I felt at that time about Formal's place in OpTic, but it wouldn't surprise me if other people, not even myself, were like, yeah, Formal isn't going anywhere if the Dynasty team makes a move, right? And it's like there could be similarities there, where just because of the success of that roster, the success of this current roster, it feels like there are players that wouldn't be moved. But that's an example of like, they moved one of the best FPS players in the world and made a trade, which trades don't ever happen in Call of Duty esports, especially player for player trades like that. So there is, an example of it happening in the past. I don't know how likely any move is at this point with this team, but we're going to have to see.
I would also say that maybe OpTic is less hesitant to do something like that because they did that in the past. And obviously, I don't think it really worked out for either party necessarily. Like, I think maybe Formal won an event after that, but it didn't work out in the sense of like he didn't have the highs of the OpTic dynasty. Obviously, OpTic did not, because that was the year that they got top 32 at champs. They've had it since then, but they didn't have it with that particular methods and Octane roster. But I think that it's a good point. It's just, it's so hard to fathom, because OpTic is more than any other team a star-driven team. They're the most popular team by themselves, but they make stars, and then those players basically have that residual star power as a result of that. Where Shotzi, like, he's going to be a bigger star at like the rest of his career, whether he's an OpTic or not, because he was an OpTic, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's the part we don't know, is like the behind the scenes, like, do they still, like each other? And, I'm not going to speculate at all about that, but like, that's the stuff you learn about after the fact, after the team breaks up. You're like, oh yeah, we hated each other. We wanted to kill each other for years. And that was the OpTic dynasty. Like, those guys talked about it. It's like, yeah, I hated that guy. Like, everybody hates Krim basically, because Krim was essentially the villain within their own team, and they butted heads constantly. The same deal in complexity. Like those guys, except TP. TP was pretty much beloved by everybody, but everybody else hated each other, and they even broke up the original Cole Dynasty with Clay to bring in Karma, which that's like a weird, kind of side thing, but yeah, that's. I mean, who knows what happens with these OpTic teams, and there's so much at play right now, and I mean, no, even talking about the OpTic Dynasty and Cole Dynasty teams, like none of them had these kind of lows, like, and that's really what I get back at too, is like, the fact that they can't win maps is the most concerning part of this all.
I do think there was a clip. I think it was the clip where they were like calling Krim. The current team was calling Krim like a Stephen A. Smith or ESPN analyst or whatever. And Kenny like made like a joke like everybody thinks we hate each other. So like the vibes really, from an outside perspective, don't seem terrible. There are moments like you look at them after they lose a map or something, and it looks the face cams look dejected and just they look down, but obviously when you're winless from a map count perspective, it's hard to blame them for that. So we again, like you said, we won't know what the vibes are really like until the dust settles and a move is made or something else happens and something if they do make a move, somebody goes off on a Twitter rant or a Twitch rant and we get a clip, and then we'll be breaking all that down at that point. The other interesting thing that you got me thinking about, though, there was another pitch. I think it was a picture, maybe OpTic tweeted of like the team in the esports arena, and they kind of looked like they were laughing, like sitting around doing like a podcast maybe before the upcoming major. So maybe that's something where we'll get some information or just some clips to break down and talk about, discuss before the major. But the other topic surrounding that I've seen people discussing is there has been like the tweet or the post of OpTic doing like a ring ceremony at Major 2 for winning champs the previous year, and like I've seen people saying like I haven't seen people saying they are going to boo OpTic at the event, but I've seen people being like, what if this team gets booed at their own ring ceremony? And I don't see that happening. The green wall for everything that we've discussed over the years about what the green wall is and stands for. Like at the end of the day, they love OpTic and they love when the team wins. And in a moment like that where they're celebrating the championship for last year, I would be shocked if the whole stadium is erupting in boos, and that would be nuts, and we would obviously discuss it if it happened, but I just don't see that being the outcome. I think that'll be a cool moment, and maybe that'll be the thing that ignites the squad and really because it'll be hard. I'm not gonna putting myself in that situation as one of those four guys with these current struggles. If I was like walking into an arena, the whole stands is going nuts, celebrating what I did last year, I would be fired up and I'd be like, yeah, I want to get back to that. I want to give back to the people and give them something to cheer about again, as opposed to what's been going on the past month.
I would just say that I don't see it happening. I don't see them booing unless they for some reason lose before that ring ceremony. Like if like I imagine that they'll do it like the beginning of day 2 or something, so they wouldn't have played yet. So like that's probably the best time to do it, because there is like a little bit of gap or a little bit of time like where you can like almost forget what's going on at the current moment. But if they were to, for whatever reason, say like the OpTic plays like the first match of day 2, and then like mid day 2 they do like the ring ceremony, I'm not saying like I expect them to be booed, but I would not be very surprised, to be honest. Like if it's fresh in people's memories of like, yeah, this team stinks and these guys are disappointing us and making us very mad, I can see it at that point. But yeah, like I think in general it's pretty hard to expect them to boo, especially like a world championship ring and not just like a regular like tournament. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Obviously, this is a very OpTic heavy episode, but I mean, they're like, I was looking through the matches just like on second glance, and I'm like, there's nothing really in these matches that are super surprising. Like even our pick'ems, like you went 9-2, I went 11-0, so that really says like we kind of expected what happened here. OpTic was, I think, one of your losses. I forget what the other one was.
Vancouver.
Yeah, so like literally there's not a huge surprise coming out of this weekend other than the fact that OpTic is just losing and continuing to lose. And then I'm sure if OpTic goes into this final weekend of qualifiers and they finish 0-7, which happens very rarely, like it happens like every few qualifiers, there's one team that just doesn't win at all. We saw quite a few, quite a bit with the Boston Breach last season, but like that's surprising in of itself. But yeah, let's move on. The CDL tweeted out this graphic. This was yesterday, Wednesday afternoon, and Maven and Nameless named their top 5 players of all time. So they both had the exact same players on these top 5s, but in different orders. Maven had Krim at 1, Simp at 2, Scump at 3, Karma at 4, and Clay at 5. And then Nameless, again, same exact players, but he had Simp at 1, Krim at 2, Karma at 3, Clay at 4, Scump at 5. I think it's not a bad list either way. Like, I think there's always going to be disagreement with these very subjective lists, especially across eras. Like Simp and Abizi are very hard players to rank. I even talked to Simp like a year ago or so about this exact topic. And, he said he said what everybody else says, like, yeah, we don't play as many events. But like, we've been very good, obviously. Like they've won 2 championships and 2 world championships, quite a few majors. The home series events, however you want to rank or, put those in the history books. And then there's the kind of like the second or third tier LAN events that teams used to go to. Like something like PAX East or something like that, or the PAX Invitational, which was like a very small event where not everybody could go. A Full Sail event, again, is like it was like an 8-team invitational. UGC Niagara, which I don't think every big team didn't go to that tournament, if I'm not mistaken. But there's like these different events in Call of Duty history there where like, what do they mean essentially? And, I think there's a healthy debate about how to rank Crimsix, like winning 40 events versus Simp, who's won like 12 or 13, I think. I don't know the exact number, but it's like it's a fraction of it. But Simp has obviously, like, to me, Simp is like in the top 5. Like, I don't care what you say. Like, there's very few players that have ever been as talented at Call of Duty as Simp is. And I think the same argument could be made in Scump's favor, because for a long time Scump didn't have a world championship, and he only has 1 compared to the rest of the players on this list have 2 or 3. So like if you compare him to the other players on the list, he's at a disadvantage, but he's also one of, if not the most talented player in Call of Duty history. So like him and Scump and Simp are kind of in the same boat in that category. And then you look at Krim, Karma, and Clay. Those are 3-time world champions. Nobody else has done it. Like just, Karma used to be like the undisputed GOAT, but then Krim won 3 and then Clay won 3. And then it comes into like, okay, like who are you going to kind of lean in favor of, especially when they all played together at one time. They all won championships together. Karma and Krim played with each other forever, basically. I think these top 5 are, you could dispute them, of course, if you want to look and you just want to say, well, where's Abizi? Because Abizi and Simp have won basically everything together. I think that's a really good argument. Formal, someone we just mentioned on this pod, you said he's one of the greatest FPS players ever, and he is. There's no debate about that. And he might be he is certainly one of the most talented players. You could say he's the most talented player in Call of Duty history. I think even a player like Octane, who does not have the accolades, I get that, but in terms of skill, he was always considered to be like one of the best players year in and year out. He's not going to make like top 5 because that's just how things go, but certainly up there. Kenny, even though he is at his lowest, I would say in terms of stock, he has the chance to become a 3-time world champion if he wins another, just the same as Abizi and Simp. And Celium is not he's not a 3-time world champion or anytime soon, but he is certainly one of the very best players that has ever played Call of Duty as well. So there's a lot of different names that you could bandy about, I guess. But what do you think of Nameless and Maven's lists here?
Yeah, I think I don't want to say issue, but for lack of a better, my thoughts on the way they did their list is I would probably do a combo of the way they did it, just because like they did this on the broadcast, and Nameless said, like, as a former player, he views the world championships differently than someone like Maven, and Maven like agrees, like, yeah, that makes sense to me that you would do it. But if you are going to put Scump at 5 because he doesn't have the same number of world championships as those other guys like Crim, Karma, and Clay, then how can you put Simp at 1 when his career isn't over and he doesn't have as many world championships as those other 3 guys below him? So that seems a little contradictory to me. At the same point, like, I just feel like I don't know. I think very highly of Simp. I don't think I could put him at 1 or 2 yet, just because his career's not done. I think he has a lot more winning to do, and it's very possible he gets to 1 before it's all said and done. But I don't think I would do it yet, and I think I would do like a combination of what Nameless did, in the sense of, because I view world championships as very important. I'm from the whole MJ over LeBron, in the sense of MJ 6-0 in the finals and all that. Obviously, Yankee fan, so I definitely am a little biased towards the whole winning championships and viewing that as more important, and as opposed to like individual accolades and whatnot. So if I was to do a list right now, I don't even think you can really put Simp above Scump just at this point right now. I get, Simp's got the, 2 world championships to Scump's 1, but I would probably, off the top of my head, for a top 5 right now, especially if I wanted to include Simp in it, because I do think, like I said, I think he'll get there one day, and I do think he's one of the best. Maybe like Simp at 5, Clay at 4, Scump at 3, Karma 2, Crim 1. I'm not even, the whole that's again, that you get into that situation of putting Scump above Clay, where Scump has 1 world championship, Clay has 3, feels a little weird. So maybe I do Crim, Karma, Clay, Scump, Simp. I don't know. I just think that's it's all subjective at the end of the day, and it's definitely up for debate. That's the whole point with all this stuff. I think that's the biggest thing I took away from seeing this list and the reaction. I do think the one thing I saw, I don't have the exact tweet, and I don't remember who said it. But I think I saw multiple people, maybe it was like on Breaking Point or something, but like obviously with those players, it's hard to include a Beezy in the top 5, but the sentiment around, like, just because of the success Simp and Beezy have had together, and the accolades are so comparable because they've done it together for their entire career, it's very hard on any list to have Simp and Beezy like so separated. Like, in a world where you put Simp 1 and then let's just say you put a Beezy 10, like, that would be strange to me, and it wouldn't make a ton of sense. Then it's just like, I guess Simp has the season MVPs that, maybe that pushes him ahead of a Beezy, but is that what's making up the difference when they have the same number of world championships, same number of championships? So I don't know. That was the only other thing that I saw people talking about.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I think 5 makes it really, really difficult, because then, like, because you didn't have to rank the rest of them, it's like, okay, like, where's this guy? It's like, well, he was 6. Like, he just didn't make the top 5. Like, that's my probably biggest gripe about it. But yeah, like I said, like, if it can't just be championships and it can't just be talent, because like it has to be a mixture of it. Obviously, like with MJ and LeBron and Kareem and like Wilt and Russell and all that, like it all comes down to, like, generally how these arguments go is like, do you have the talent? Are you like, were you one of the best players in your time? if yes, okay, you get to go into the next room, and then we get to debate like whether 6 championships in this era is worth more than 4 championships in this era, or if 11 championships in this era is worth more than the 5 championships in this era, so on and so forth. And I think that is what it comes down to here. I think however you make your list, I wrote down like 11 names, just like I know that they won 2 championships, and well, some of these guys have won 2 championships, or were just like the best players in their era. Like a guy like JCap certainly deserves more credit than, like, he's not going to make a top 5, I'm sure, of most people's list, but I think he might be a part of the most Champs Grand Finals in history. I know he was in the first Champs Grand Finals. He obviously lost to OpTic in their Grand Finals, so that's 4 because he's won 2 already. So like that's pretty incredible.
Sim's also been in 4.
Yeah. So there's that. I think people they kind of discount that, or like almost use it as a negative sometimes, of like, well, you made it but then you lost. I think that's kind of ridiculous in the sense of like JCap had like the highest Champs Grand Finals placing for like so many years until like his last few years where he was like on OGLA or whatever. But like he was consistently very high up there. You also have to take into account, at least in those first like 3 or 4 years, Champs was like in the middle of the season. So it was just kind of like a random event, essentially. Like there was qualification for it, but it wasn't like the grand finale of the season. So you could basically have an incredible season and just not win champs. And that could be held against you in these legacy talks, I guess. But even that now, like, let's say you have an incredible season and then you just don't win champs at the end of the year, like that's going to be held against you because champs is deemed the most important and most prestigious event. And we'll see if Esports World Cup has anything to say about that, I guess. But like the most talented players, I guess, would be like Scump, Formal, like Hydra. Probably he's not, like, the longevity is not there, but like he certainly like Hydra and Scrap will probably be in that conversation eventually.
I think so.
Simp, Abizi, Cell are, like Cell doesn't have the accolades like in terms of championships. Apathy will never be on these lists, even though he was one of the first 2-time world champs. Like, very few. Aches, obviously, like he's just kind of a different era essentially, and that will be held against him because he didn't have really any success like post World War II. He just didn't have very much success. Like once he won his second champs, it just never really clicked again for him. Arcides again will not be in these conversations, even though like for a while he was one of the best ARs in the world. But yeah, like I don't know exactly what my list would be. Like in no order, I guess, would be Simp. It would honestly be these 5 players probably. Like I don't know. Like I think Formal probably should be in there. I'm not exactly sure in place of who, I guess, but like I have no argument against these 5 players. However you list them is just like, that's whatever. Like that's impossible. Like if you asked anybody to name the top 5 NBA players, like I'm sure they have the 5 players like in general, but the exact order is going to be up for debate. But yeah, I think this is an interesting topic. I think we did talk about this at some point, like over the off season or something, or maybe
when we did the whole, we dedicated an episode to it. It was after the fact of champs when we realized, like, damn, Shotzi and Kenny both have 2 champs now. Like, where do they sit in the all-time conversation? And we broke it down.
Yeah. And I guess Shotzi, and I did write Kenny down on my list, I just didn't say him, but those guys like certainly have an argument. Dashy, in terms of skill, like he would be up there just like any modern player, I guess. But that's the thing is like only winning 1 champs is going to be difficult unless you're Scump. Like Scump is like the kind of the anomaly, and like maybe Selk, if he has like the longevity of Scump, then you could say like, oh, look at these guys, like they were just so talented, it just didn't break their way essentially. But yeah, that would be my argument for it, but that's, debate however you want about it, I guess. Let's get into these predictions. Obviously, like I mentioned a little bit ago, I went 11-0 on these past week's matches. You went 9-2. So you're 75-39 on the season. I'm 70-44. And this is the final week of the Major 2 qualifiers. Next week, all the teams are going down to Texas, those that aren't already in Texas, I guess, and they'll be competing at Major 2. Friday, March 14th is the first day of the final week of qualifiers. Vancouver versus Toronto starting us off. I'll go with the Vancouver Surge, but this is a pretty interesting matchup just to see where the Ultra are in comparison to the Surge, who have been really, really good as of late.
We saw this in the minor, and I believe it was the semifinals to get to the finals.
I believe
pretty
so.
sure. Yeah, Vancouver 3-0'd them. So I'm taking Vancouver here, but I am excited for this match, just especially, Toronto had a good week this past week, all things considered. It was against Vegas and OpTic. So you can, say what you want about that, but, end of the day, I think this should be a good matchup. I still think Vancouver is the better team at this point, though, and Vancouver should come out on top, but, Joe DeCeves is dropping 48 kills again. Toronto might find a way to win.
LAT versus OpTic, going with LAT.
Yep, I'll take LAT. This should be one that even if OpTic were playing much, 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 much better than they are currently, you're still probably favoring LAT because, like you said almost an hour ago at this point, they are 15-1 map count in this qualifiers. They have looked very strong. So, this is a match I expect Nadeshot to be very happy with the outcome of, but it's also an opportunity, if OpTic has some good practice and they majorly turn things around, if they somehow found a way to win this, that could completely change their entire season.
Yeah, for sure. Carolina versus Miami, the last match on Friday. Gonna go with Carolina.
Yep, I'll take Carolina too.
Saturday, March 15th, Miami versus Boston. I'll go with Miami. I'm kind of doubting my Breach boys, but they've had close matches, so maybe they can pull this one out. I'm just not fully expecting them to do that.
Yeah, I was expecting you to go Boston. And I don't really want to pick Boston, but just the way Boston played in that last match against Atlanta kind of gave me some thought in the back of my mind, especially, Cammy hasn't played very well individually, but he kind of played pretty well towards the end of that series, and especially before the reset in the map 5. So I'll take Boston here. I don't like the pick, but I want to make sure we got some differences.
LAT versus Minnesota. Gonna go with LAT, but I think this is a pretty good matchup for Minnesota.
Yeah, we said this the last time LAT and Minnesota played in the Major 1 qualifiers. I think it was the second week because Minnesota was like 2-0 playing LA Thieves, and it was like we were interested to see how they were going to match up, and then LAT won it. I think this has the potential to be a closer match than some people might expect, but just based on the way LAT's playing, they can't pick against them.
Vegas versus Carolina.
Yep.
LAG versus Atlanta.
I'll take Atlanta.
Sunday, March 16th.
Here we go.
Most interesting matchup of these qualifiers. OpTic versus LAG. I will go with LAG, but wow. I think if there is a match out there aside from Vegas, this is the match.
I mean, I did it last week, OpTic versus Miami. I didn't love it, but I really thought, maybe OpTic could turn things around, and it ended up costing me. I'm going to pick OpTic again. They really haven't given me a reason to. But again, kind of like I said, we were talking about Skies. Like the Gentlemate squad, it just hasn't really seemed to turn a corner with any of its recent moves. So this is another opportunity for OpTic to try and bounce back. And I think they're going to want to do everything they can to avoid that, 0-7, 0-21 map count if they get 3-0'd by the Thieves. So I don't love it, but I'll take OpTic here.
Minnesota versus Vancouver. Going to go with Vancouver.
Yeah, again, similar to tough week for Minnesota, really. You got to play LAT and Vancouver, the two teams that were in the minor finals. But it's a good test for the Minnesota squad. We've seen them play top teams very tough all season long. I'm still going to go with Vancouver, but I'm excited for both of Minnesota's matchups, even though it feels like it'll be a tough week. It could be a strong tune-up for them in the sense of like even if they go 0-2, could be some solid practice for them heading into the major.
Yeah, and if they lose both these matches, they'll enter the major with a 3-4 record. Like that's a pretty deceiving 3-4, I would say. So
Yeah,
they'll probably be underrated going into that event.
definitely.
And then the last match of the qualifiers and of the weekend, C9 versus Atlanta. I'm interested to see how C9 actually plays because they've been playing really well as of late. But obviously, this is a cross country matchup, and we've talked
Yep.
about so much about C9 and online and everything. And Atlanta is also just a really good team. So I'll go with Atlanta, but I'm very interested.
Yeah, and that was we kind of, you know, I don't want to say skipped over it, but when I was doing my breakdown of the matches from this past week, we did see C9 play Carolina, and Carolina won that match 3-1. Similar situation there for cross country battle in terms of location. And I don't think it necessarily felt like there was like server cheese or anything going on, but Gwen just played really well in that series. So um, if it's gonna be like, even playing field from a server standpoint, you got to give the edge to Atlanta, and even if there is some server stuff going on, you still think Atlanta's the better team. They just might get um, you know might lose some more gunfights than they normally do, but we'll have to wait and see. I think Atlanta should win. Atlanta's a better team, but just the way Cloud9's been playing, plus if they get some, a favorable server or something like that, maybe they make something happen. But this should be a um, interesting way to end the qualifiers. Nonetheless, still think Atlanta will win.
Yeah, and really the biggest thing for right now is C9. The only good team they've beaten in these qualifiers is Toronto, and whether you want to say they're good or not is depending on the week, I guess, with Toronto. But they beat Boston, they beat Vegas, and beat LAG otherwise, and then they lost to Carolina and Vancouver. So like they lost to two good teams. They beat three pretty bad teams, or Boston, you could say just like kind of mediocre or whatever. And then Toronto is kind of hit or miss by themselves. And I believe that there was some debate about the online stuff in that match in particular. So,
Yeah,
like, who knows exactly what to expect. But either way, like, C9 has gotten themselves into a position where they're locked into the winner's bracket of Major 2, regardless of what happens this weekend, which is not the case in Major 1. Like, I think they went 2-5 or 1-6 in those qualifiers. So, certainly a better spot to be in for C9. But yeah, we'll talk about all of these matches on Sunday's pod. That is Sunday, March 16th. So we'll be back to kind of a normal schedule as far as I know. We'll, obviously if we don't have a podcast, we don't have a podcast, but we're fully expecting to be back on the 2 days per week schedule from here on out. Sundays and Wednesdays for live shows, Mondays and Thursdays for when the podcast goes into your feed. Make sure to like, subscribe, or follow the podcast wherever you're listening or watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and you can also watch the live show and watch the VODs on YouTube. Just search up Ego Chall Podcast on YouTube. You can also watch live on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. While you're on Twitch, you can also go over to JBINKK. That's Bink's Twitch channel, and I don't know if he's had the streak, if that died at all, but we're almost
Day
approached.
64 later today.
Yeah, so I was about to say 2 months, but we're a little over 2 months, I guess, consecutively streaming. So you can go follow Bink on Twitch. You can follow us on Twitter as well, at JBink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers. The podcast tour is at Ego Chall Podcast. And again, next show will be on March 16th, and we should be back to our normal schedule. And that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for all the support. Yeah, it was a bit of a longer show because we didn't have the show past Sunday, but pretty good breakdown, I guess. Very long OpTic segment there. So if you are you know, an OpTic unapologist or just someone who doesn't like any negativity, I think for the most part we were very fair and just giving our honest thoughts on the OpTic situation. But I wouldn't be surprised if some OpTic fans thought we were hating in some regards. But regardless of that, I think that was a good segment. And, at the end of the day, it is what it is. But if you have any thoughts on anything we've said or anything like that, let us know. Obviously, Preston shouted him out earlier, but we had Michael Manila in the YouTube chat today. So shout out, Michael. Thanks for supporting the live stream. And yeah, we'll be back on Sunday. Matches tomorrow already, so final online qualifiers before Major 2, and then we'll break down that. We'll have the bracket and everything, and then we'll have a preview show next week. And we're back on land in literally 7 days. It'll be, 3 hours. It usually starts around 1 or 2 Eastern on that Thursday, I feel. So it's almost exactly a week from when we'll be watching some land Call of Duty again. So exciting times ahead. Hope you guys are tuning in to those matches and able to tune in to us, whether it's live or just in VOD form. And yeah, you got any thoughts or anything like that, let us know. But other than that, thank you for the support. And remember to send the chow.